Now, for weeks and weeks, we've been talking on air about the Kelly O'Dwyer parliamentary inquiry into foreign purchases of Australian real estate. Kelly O'Dwyer is someone not widely known. She's a very bright young lady who replaced Peter Costello in the Victorian safe Liberal seat of Higgins. Now, this parliamentary inquiry was to have reported this month. This has now been postponed until the 28th of November, and some of you were saying, is that in order not to offend China, which is reportedly on the verge of signing a free trade agreement with Australia? We can't wait till then. A recent survey by the National Australia Bank has found that foreign purchasers, that's purchasers people, bought 1 in every 12 established Australian houses and 1 in every 6 new properties sold in the last 6 months. Foreign purchasers. In other words, the illegality appears to have continued unabated over the past 3 months under the nose of the Kelly O'Dwyer inquiry. They just don't care. Not Kelly O'Dwyer, the real estate agents and those purchasing. Now, as you know, under federal law, foreigners without resident visas are supposedly prevented from buying established homes in Australia and restricted to buying, quote, off the plan, unquote, apartment properties only. The Chinese buyers spent $5.9 billion on Australian established homes last financial year. That's in 1 year alone, without a single prosecution launched by the Foreign Investment Review Board. The sheer volume of property sales to foreigners revealed by the latest National Australia Bank survey means not all these recent purchases can be legal. But where is the Foreign Investment Review Board on all of this? Up the creek. It told the O'Dwyer inquiry earlier this year that it didn't even have the resources to answer a question about how many investigations it had initiated. Her inquiry asked them. We don't have the resources to answer the question. I don't think we can wait until the 28th of November. We then learn that Chinese buyers have tripled their spending on Queensland real estate, farmland and commercial property since the global financial crisis. Last year, they spent $462 million in Queensland, $185 million of that in the Brisbane City Council area, most probably residential. $196 million on Gold Coast property, residential accommodation. China's now the biggest source of foreign investment in real estate in Queensland. No wonder the poor 25-year-olds can't afford to buy anything. Now, the focus is on these statistics in Queensland because Queensland is the only state to track purchases by offshore buyers. As I said, the Kelly O'Dwyer Parliamentary Standing Committee on Economics is investigating whether foreign investment is fueling out-of-control property price rises. The committee was due to report 10 days ago. It's been extended until next month after the G20 summit in Brisbane. You're writing to me saying you hope this hasn't been manipulated because of the government's obsession with a free trade agreement with China. I thought we'd talk to Kelly O'Dwyer because her committee has done an outstanding job at least letting the public know or confirming what the public thought they knew, and it has been rather interesting indeed. She's on the line. Kelly O'Dwyer, good morning.
Good morning, Alan.
Thank you for your time. Why hasn't your report been handed down to the government when it was meant to be handed down rather than being delayed until November 28?
Well, I can assure you, Alan, there's certainly no conspiracy with it. We actually are front-loading our report and we're doing the consultation that is required with the states and territories for one of our key recommendations. That requires about 4 weeks of consultation. That key recommendation is exactly what you touched on just before, which is to have a national register where at the transfer of title level we work out exactly who has purchased the residential property so that we can say with certainty when you ask the question, how much of residential property is actually owned by overseas investors, we will be able to answer that question when we have a national register.
But the survey by the National Australian Bank gives cause for concern, doesn't it? Foreign purchasers bought 1 in every 12 established Australian houses, that is illegal, and 1, unless they've got a resident visa, and 1 in every 6 new properties sold in the past 3 months. Surely at least some of this has to be illegal and it just continues unabated.
Well, certainly what's very clear and what's been very clear from the evidence, Alan, is that there has been no prosecution by the Foreign Investment Review Board since 2006. And when we asked the Foreign Investment Review Board, why is it that you have not been able to undertake any prosecution for a breach in our foreign investment framework with respect to residential property, they said that they feel that everybody is far more compliant. Now, I think that completely defies credibility. I think your listeners understand that that defies credibility. There clearly are some people who will try and get around the rules, and we have to make sure that where we have rules in place, they are properly and strictly enforced.
But I thought the Foreign Investment Review Board also said that they hadn't been appropriated adequate resources by Treasury.
Well, look, I don't accept that as an excuse. They were certainly able to conduct divestments. They were able to conduct prosecutions before 2006. But I do accept that additional resources for the Foreign Investment Review Board will help their job in auditing, compliance and also enforcement. And we've been considering some recommendations as to how money can be hypothecated to FIRB for the purposes of increasing their resources so they can do their job much better.
$5.9 billion on Australian established homes. Established homes, that's against the law unless they have a resident visa. Established homes last financial year, that's a lot of spending.
Well, the $5.9 billion is a combination of both residential real estate as well as commercial real estate, that figure. The actual figure for the first 9 months of this year for residential real estate, according to the FIRB data, was about $24.8 billion. And that's a significant amount of money. So we recognise that there is certainly a lot of investment in Australian residential property at the moment, and buyers who are non-resident are prohibited under our current laws from being able to purchase residential property, and those rules need to be properly enforced.
Absolutely. It's a struggle for young people to get into property. How far do your terms of reference go? Because last week that this board was on fire here, we learnt that 3 multi-million-dollar mega deals are currently in progress, which will see Chinese government-owned companies either purchasing large stakes in or owning some of Australia's largest dairy operations. In Western Victoria, 50 dairy farms, your state, have signed individual deals to sell their farms worth a collective $400 million to what was described as a secretive dairy conglomerate being put together by a Tasmanian developer. And those 50 farms run a total of 90,000 cows, producing 500 million litres of milk a year. That's a 12th of Victoria's total milk supply. And we're told the Chinese conglomerate, the Chinese stake in the conglomerate, it's only 49%. We don't know if any other individual stakeholder holds more than 49%, in which case China could effectively have control. And then we also learned that Van Diemen's Land Company, another big Tasmanian dairying outfit, is negotiating to sell 25 of its dairy farms, running 18,000 milking cows to the Chinese. And Landmark Harcourts, plural, Harcourts, another Tasmanian outfit, is reportedly marketing 12 of its dairy farms to the Chinese. Aren't we entitled to say what the hell is going on?
Well, look, our inquiry is looking broadly at foreign investment in residential real estate. It's not looking at agricultural real estate. But I can assure you, Alan, that we took an election promise to the last election, which we will be delivering on very shortly, which is to screen all agricultural land worth more than $15 million through the Foreign Investment Review Board.
Is that happening?
To make sure it's not contrary to the national interest. Well, that's a question that needs to be answered by the Treasurer or by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer. But my understanding is that this is something that we are implementing.
But doesn't that require legislation or regulation?
Look, I understand it would simply be a matter of regulation, so it wouldn't require legislation because the Foreign Investment Review Board simply needs an indication.
I don't understand. I mean, you're a young lady and you're new to the Parliament and you're very bright and all the rest. I don't understand how young people down there in the Parliament, because you're going to be around for another 30 years. I mean, how you say, well, what is our country going to look like in 30 years' time when, in fact, the productive assets are just being sold off? Cubby Station has been sold to the Chinese, and we're now buying that water back, $47 million a year from Cubby Station. Some of the biggest land holdings in Western Australia have been sold to the Chinese. You've got your state where farms in northwestern Victoria have been bought out by the Qatar government, and they clearly say that's designed to put our produce on their plates. Now, what's this going to look like in 30 years' time? The Newman government is now saying in Queensland it's going to sell $37 billion of state assets if it wins next year's state election. To whom? Does it matter, Kelly, who runs the country if we don't own the damn place?
It certainly matters, Alan, who runs the country. There's no question about that.
Well, not if we don't own it.
You make a really interesting point, and the $15 million threshold, I must say to you, does not apply to state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises or sovereign wealth funds, so any government-controlled company, it's a $0 threshold. That must go through FIRB directly. There is no threshold required before FIRB can look at it, and they must look at it before that goes through. do. So a state-owned enterprise or a sovereign wealth fund, that must go through the Foreign
Investment. But if the Foreign Investment Review Board can't initiate any inquiry into illegal house purchases, how can we be guaranteed they're any good at doing anything else? I mean, you and your government were last year involved with this Archer Daniels Midland purchase of, or at least offer to purchase for $3.2 billion GrainCorp. Now, I mean, I heard all that debate, and your government, which denied it at the time, was accused of being terrible people and prejudicing the national interest. This outfit, Archer Daniels Midland, late last year disclosed it had more than doubled, that's up to US $54 million, the amount set aside for potential penalties for alleged breaches of foreign corrupt practices legislation in the United States. Didn't provide details. There was talk that its violations of United States law were more severe than suspected, and this mob are coming back for a second shot at GrainCorp. Patrick Byrne, the co-author of the book How Free Trade in Water Will Cripple Australian Agriculture, says, quote, if the Australian grain trading company AWB Limited's culpability in the oil for wheat scandal involving kickbacks to the former Iraqi dictatorship of Saddam Hussein warranted the dismantling in 2008 of Australia's wheat single-selling desk, then the government should reject US corporation Archer Daniels Midland's takeover bid for Australia's GrainCorp, given ADM's long history of corruption. Are we going to entertain this mob buying our assets? I can't believe it.
Well, look, I can't speak for the Treasurer. The Treasurer ultimately makes...
No, but your competence, your intellectual competence is in this area.
Well, what I can say is that I know that the Treasurer looks at whether or not these purchases are contrary to the national interest, and they take into account a range of information. The Treasurer has very broad discretion when he makes a decision about these foreign investment applications, and they also seek information from a variety of agencies within government and external to government to make sure that that is the best possible decision that can be made.
All I'm saying, Kelly, is that this crowd in 1997 had awarded against them, a US court imposed a $100 million antitrust corruption fine on this crowd, the largest of its kind in US history, and the then Assistant Attorney General said, why? Because it was commensurate with the crimes that we had discovered that Archer Daniels Midland committed here. Why would we even entertain bringing this mob into our country?
Well, we have to look at every application that comes before the Treasurer. The Treasurer has to consider every application that comes before him, and he looks at all of the evidence. And I think you, Alan, would recognise that that's the appropriate way to deal with these applications. Certainly, I respect that you've clearly done quite a lot of research on this particular issue, and clearly you're aware of information that I'm not privy to. But I'd be very surprised if the Treasurer didn't look at every one of these applications.
Well, I'm sure he did, and then was vilified from one end of the country to the other because he said no. That was the point. I mean, poll after poll in this area that you're involved in, poll after poll shows that a massive majority of Australians disapprove of the sale of our farms to foreigners. Yet you've got this China's richest man, Zhong Qinghu, last year travelling around Western Australia looking to buy a dairy farm on which he's going to build a milk processing plant. He couldn't find one large enough, so he started looking in Victoria, and they're looking for ownership, not investment, and that means our produce from these farms will be sent straight to China, our paddock to their plate, no tax paid in Australia on that produce, our food supply diminished. Our listeners can't get their heads around this, Kelly.
Oh, well, certainly any tax that is due to the Australian government is payable to the Australian government. We would make sure of that. Now, in terms of the situation you've just outlined, as I said, our terms of reference have very much been focused on residential real estate.
But I'm just wondering if you can't lend your intellectual clout to the wider issue. When the Qatar government has spent $500 million over 3 years buying Australian farms in 4 states covering 250,000 hectares. We've got to go, but it is a big, big issue, Kelly.
Thanks very much, Alan. It's been a delight to speak with you.
You're most welcome. We will talk again.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's Kelly O'Dwyer. She's a bright young lady, but that's an enormous issue, isn't it?
Australian-owned and operated.